Hey guys, tonight we step into the towering, windswept world of medieval castles. Stone giants rising from hillsides, their banners flapping, their towers looming. It all looks majestic in paintings and movies. But don't get too cozy. These weren't exactly palaces of comfort. They were more like stone-clad nightmares, cold, creaky, paranoid death traps designed to defend, intimidate, and, well, accidentally kill the very people living inside them. You probably won't survive this. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments, where are you watching from? And what time is it for you right now? Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You walk across the drawbridge, the wooden boards clacking beneath your feet, the moat below silently daring you to slip. The massive gatehouse creaks open just enough for you to squeeze through. Welcome to your new home. Within 5 steps, you're standing in what feels like a stone wind tunnel. The main courtyard echoes with clanging iron, shouting servants, and the clatter of hooves on uneven cobblestones. This place was built to keep enemies out, but it also does a pretty good job of trapping danger inside. The entrance itself is a fortress within a fortress. Above your head, rows of murder holes gape open like stone mouths just waiting for someone to dump boiling pitch or sand. Yeah, sand. Superheated sand was a real thing. They'd heat it in iron pans until it was hot enough to sear skin, then rain it down on invaders, or occasionally their own soldiers. Oops. Past the gate, you're flanked by arrow slits, narrow openings in the walls that allow archers to fire out, but leave you with no clear idea of where the shots are coming from. You step sideways to avoid the line of fire, just in case. You make it into the bailey, the main open courtyard, which somehow feels both vast and claustrophobic. There are people everywhere, blacksmiths hammering stable boys, shouting pigs, rooting through mud, and guards glaring suspiciously at you, like you might be part of an assassination plot. To be fair, in the 13th century, that wouldn't be all that uncommon. The stone walls rise up around you like cliffs. They're not smooth either. They're jagged, pockmarked, mossy, and strangely damp. Moisture creeps in everywhere. Rain doesn't drain well off stone, so in every corner, there's a puddle or a slime-coated crack. You might want to invest in some medieval boots, or a tetanus shot. Too bad neither exist yet. Let's talk battlements. Those classic notched tops of castle walls. They're called crenellations. Designed for defense, sure, but also terrible if you're trying to get a peaceful night's sleep and the wind's howling through them like some angry forest spirit. They whistle, constantly. And during storms, the wind shrieks through the slits like a banshee. Not great for the nerves or the sinuses, and don't even think about lounging in the towers. The spiral staircases are narrow, uneven, and twist clockwise. Why, so defenders coming down had more room to swing their swords. You a guest without a weapon. You're at a serious disadvantage. Hope your balance is decent, because one misstep on those centuries-old stairs, and you're rolling like a barrel down a death spiral. Historians still argue whether the average castle layout was more about defense or psychological warfare. Some believe the overwhelming verticality and confined movement weren't just strategic, they were a statement. You're supposed to feel small, lost, and a little bit terrified. Oh, and about that moat. It's not just a pretty medieval water feature. Some were filled with spikes, others with rotting meat, And if you thought you'd just swim across in a daring escape, remember medieval hygiene wasn't great. That water might be closer to a disease soup. And if you fall in, well, enjoy your tetanus and dysentery. Quirky side note. Some castles had swan pits in their moats. Regal right, not when the swans get territorial. Those things are aggressive. You haven't lived until you've been chased by a hissing feathered torpedo. Anyway, you've made it inside. You're technically safe. Except for the arrows, the boiling sand, the disease moat, the suspicious guards, and the wind that sounds like it's actively trying to whisper curses into your ear. Welcome to castle life. The stone trap has closed behind you, so you've survived the courtyard, a minor miracle. But before you get too cocky, let's take you to your chamber for the night. A soft bed, a warm fire, a locking door. Just kidding. This is a medieval castle. Your room might be a glorified stone closet, and even that could try to murder you while you sleep. First, mind your head. Ceilings are low archways, uneven, and beams often slant at strange angles because nothing in this place was built with comfort in mind. You duck through a crooked wooden door and step into your quarters. There's a narrow window with no glass, just a flap of oiled linen, doing its best to keep the wind out. Spoiler, it's not working. The bed. A lumpy straw mattress crawling with whatever happened to be living in the straw before it became your pillow. Fleas, lice, maybe a couple of very determined beetles. The blankets are wool scratchy, and how to say this gently, mysteriously damp. Always damp. Castle walls absorb moisture like sponges and radiate it into everything, including your sheets. You decide to light a fire in the small hearth to take the chill off. Good luck with that. Chimneys are new tech in this century, and they don't always draw smoke up properly. Half the time it spills right back into the room, giving you two solid options: freeze or slowly smoke yourself like a side of ham. Many castle dwellers did both. And let's not forget the roof. If your room's anywhere near the upper levels, you're likely under a thatch or wooden roof. Yes, even in castles. One loose spark, one overturned candle, and boom, inferno. Castles did burn down. A lot. Whole wings vanished overnight. Fire was the medieval equivalent of a household accident, except with fewer survivors. Still feeling cozy, even the walls themselves could betray you. Medieval plaster was made with lime, and when lime gets wet, it can react violently. There are cases of internal walls collapsing, or even exploding during heavy rain if the mix was off. Historians still argue whether this was poor craftsmanship or just nature's way of keeping medieval architects humble. Now imagine you have to relieve yourself. It's the middle of the night, it's raining, and the chamber pot is full. You open the side door and head to the garderobe, a private medieval bathroom. If you're lucky, it's a stone seat built over a shaft that drops straight to the moat. If you're unlucky, it's just a hole over a pit. Either way, the smell is fierce, and the risk of slipping on a wet, mossy step and plunging headfirst into the chute, very real. And don't lean out too far while doing your business. Guardrobe shafts were occasionally used by assassins trying to sneak in or poison the air with sulfurous concoctions. Yes, bathroom-based warfare was a thing. Because why not? Also worth noting the timber beams supporting many castle floors prone to woodworm. Over time, these little guys hollow out beams until they're one awkward shuffle away from snapping. You hear a distant crack in the night. That's not a ghost, it's the floor planning your downfall. And speaking of ghosts, medieval people loved a good haunting. If your room creaks, howls, or smells like sulfur, Congratulations, you might be bunking in a chamber where some unlucky lord met a messy end. Word would travel fast. Oh, you're in the old East Wing. Yeah, that's where Sir Geoffrey fell through the latrine floor and drowned in shame. Sweet dreams. Jokes aside, these rooms could be dangerous in genuinely unexpected ways. Some castles had built-in defense features like collapsible staircases or trapdoors perfect in a siege, but occasionally triggered by, say, a drunken noble stumbling home from a feast. Imagine thinking you're stepping onto the hallway and just vanishing into the darkness. Let's not forget about insects either. Those charming tapestries hanging on the walls, giant breeding grounds for moths, mites, and the occasional spider the size of a spoon. You'd think they were decorative. Mostly they were insulation. Bad insulation. And because nothing in a medieval castle can just be normal, sometimes even your bed was booby-trapped. A few recorded cases show security beds that locked shut with wooden latches or iron bars to protect the sleeper from attacks. Sounds smart until you realize they also jammed. You could get stuck in your own bed coffin. Not exactly restful. Here's a quirky detail for you. Medieval people often slept sitting up propped on pillows because lying flat was associated with death. And in rooms this unpredictable, honestly, they might have had a point. So there you are, in your chilly stone room, sitting upright on your infested straw mattress, wrapped in a damp wool blanket, breathing in fireplace smoke, while your bathroom fumes waft through the door like a chemical attack. You think the worst is over, but then the wind howls through the chimney and the wooden beam above you creaks with the weight of the floor above. You lie awake wondering, is that just old wood shifting? Or is it your ceiling about to flatten you in your sleep? It's probably nothing. Probably. Morning comes, if you can call it that. It's still mostly dark because castle windows are tiny slits made for defense, not daylight. You stumble out of your freezing bed with a crick in your neck and a healthy fear of your own ceiling. Time to explore the rest of your new home. First, stop the stairs. Oh, these stairs. At first glance, they seem straightforward stone spirals hugging a central pillar, leading either up to the battlements or down into the unknown. But after your third near face plant, you realize something's off. These stairs aren't symmetrical. They twist clockwise. Always clockwise. It's not a design quirk, it's a murder tactic. You see, most people are right-handed. So defenders coming down the stairs had more room to swing their swords, while attackers trying to climb up had their sword arms jammed into the wall. Brilliant for battle. Terrible if you're just trying to carry a tray of food without pitching over the edge like a medieval cartoon character. And the steps themselves uneven. Sometimes shallow, sometimes tall, sometimes worn down in the middle, so they dip like a smile made of stone. No railings, of course. That's not a luxury here. One misstep and you're tumbling down 30 spiral feet into a corner where the bones of previous stair casualties may or may not still be hiding. Historians still argue whether this unevenness was intentional sabotage or just sloppy stonemasonry. Either way it works. Against you. Now let's head downstairs into the basement levels. You know, for fun. The lighting, practically non-existent. You're carrying a sputtering torch, maybe a candle that drips hot wax all over your hand. The walls are damp, the air smells like mildew, and the stone under your feet is slick with condensation, or worse. You grip the walls as you descend. Smart move. One false step down here, and you don't just fall, you vanish. Some castle stairwells were designed to narrow until you couldn't pass without ducking or crawling. You can practically hear the ceiling trying to crush you. Some castles even had dead-end stairs designed to lead attackers into a trap. No way out, but back up with defenders waiting above to rain arrows, rocks, or very large insults down upon them. More than one castle record includes incidents where servants, children, or unlucky guests accidentally used these fake staircases and got stuck for hours or longer. Here's a bizarre little tidbit for you. Some spiral staircases had secret grooves carved into the walls just big enough to hide a short sword. Surprise defense weapons ready to be pulled by the lord or lady of the house in case of ambush. Imagine trying to find that when you're half asleep on your way to use the guardrobe. Worse yet, castles weren't built all at once. They were often expanded over decades or centuries like stone patchwork quilts. That means staircases could abruptly stop led nowhere or shift levels in baffling ways. A staircase might end at a door 5 feet above the floor on the next level, requiring you to jump down or haul yourself up, depending on the mood of medieval architects that year. This led to plenty of practical comedy people with broken ankles, twisted knees, or just plain rage crying after falling into yet another architectural dead end. Also, forget any romantic notions of a dramatic escape up the tower stairs. Most of those were blocked with heavy wooden trapdoors or iron grates slowed by rust, secured with keys long lost to time, and perfectly designed to slam shut when you're halfway through. It's not just the design of the stairs that's dangerous, it's what's happening on them. Imagine a servant girl carrying a bucket of boiling water from the kitchen to the solar. She trips. The water spills. The next 3 people to use those steps get the medieval equivalent of a slip and slide straight into the afterlife. Add to that the fact that castle interiors were dark even during the day, and your odds of surviving a month here without a major stair-related injury not great. And hey, you wanted that upper chamber with a nice view, didn't you? Hope you enjoy climbing 30 spiral stairs every single time you forget your gloves, or your sword, or your dignity. Some castles had ladders instead of stairs between certain levels, wooden steep slippery, with age and weather, and just tall enough to make falling a very unfun possibility. Picture yourself halfway up holding a candle in your teeth when the ladder shifts slightly beneath your feet. The crack isn't thunder, it's your knee, but nothing compares to the infamous turn step, a stair carved deliberately crooked at one point, just to throw off someone running too fast. That someone, usually an intruder, but sometimes just a very unlucky court jester in a hurry. And no, there's no shortcut elevator, no dumbwaiter, just you, gravity, and the architectural equivalent of a cruel joke. So you grip the wall, step carefully, and mutter under your breath about medieval safety codes. There weren't any. All the while, you can't shake the feeling that this castle wasn't just built to repel attackers. It was built to challenge you to survive it. You survived the stairs. Barely. You're sore, annoyed, and developing a healthy suspicion of all stone structures. But you press on, determined to explore more of the castle. And that's when you realize you really need to use the bathroom. Which brings us to the next great architectural hazard, the toilets. They're called guardrobes, a word that sounds fancy, but basically translates to stone hole in a wall with a terrifying drop. You're expecting maybe a quaint little outhouse. You find a dark, drafty chute hanging over open air, possibly overhanging the moat, possibly not. You peek in and get a face full of stench so potent it could be weaponized. And in fact, it was. See, guardrobes were often located on outer walls, projecting out in little stone box towers. Waste would fall straight into the moat, or into a cesspit, if you were lucky. If not, it just kind of accumulated. There was no flush, no water system, just gravity and regret. And yes, these things clogged. Medieval plumbing maintenance involved scraping, scooping, and flinging, usually by the lowest-ranking servant or some poor soul whose job title could have been professional trauma collector. But the worst part, the guardrobe, was a security threat. During sieges, enemies would crawl up the waste chute, braving disease and sludge just to infiltrate the castle. In fact, one famous 1200s castle was captured this way through the latrine. Think about that next time you sit down. To prevent this, some castles built iron bars across the base of the chute called murder bars. Effective, unless someone forgot to maintain them. You don't want to be the one discovering they've rusted clean through after slipping. And it wasn't just enemies you had to worry about. There are recorded incidents of castle residents, yes, even nobles, falling into guardrobes. No, really. Whether it was the result of a drunken stumble, a loose stone, or a tragic misstep in the dark, people have literally been flushed into history. Historians still argue whether guardrobes were intentionally designed to be uncomfortable as a way to limit their use and reduce smell throughout the castle. If that was the case, bravo, because they achieved exactly that. Oh, and here's a charming fringe detail. Medieval folk believed that evil spirits could climb up through latrines. So some guardrobes were constructed with little stone shelves holding herbs, charms, or even sharp objects like broken glass to trap malevolent beings before they could enter your, most vulnerable area. While you sit there, eyes watering from the ammonia-laced stench, freezing wind howling through the chute, you can also admire the colony of fungus blooming on the damp stone walls. It's not just gross, it's dangerous. Fungal spores in confined, unventilated spaces could trigger serious respiratory issues, and back then, doctor often meant barber, who also owns a saw. Even if you avoid falling, or summoning evil spirits, or breathing in too much toxic mold, you still have to navigate the long, drafty corridor back to your room, possibly in the middle of the night. Possibly while holding a flickering candle. Definitely while trying not to think about what's growing on your shoes. Sometimes, if you were very wealthy or very lucky, you might have a close stool, a kind of medieval porta-potty, a wooden box with a hole on top and a chamber pot inside. Easier, right? Well, unless it got forgotten. People used to reuse chamber pots for days at a time, and the smell, it didn't just stay in the pot. It infused the room, the linens, possibly your soul. And as we said in Section 2, chamber pots were often just left, full, under beds, tucked in corners, or accidentally kicked over during a night panic when someone thought the rats were back. You get the idea. Sanitation was less daily routine and more occasional catastrophe. If you're thinking, well, I'll just wait and go outside, congratulations, you've chosen the other awful option. The outer yards often doubled as impromptu toilets. No privacy, no dignity, and every step was a gamble, especially in winter. And get this, in some castles, the guard-robes emptied onto the heads of attackers. Yep, defenders literally weaponized waste during sieges. Picture that you're trying to breach the walls when suddenly it's not just arrows raining down. It's chamber pot contents and boiling urine, a real medieval combo attack. So whether it's clogged pipes, icy seats, collapsing stonework, spiritual possession, or a goat that wandered in while you were distracted, yes, that happened. Medieval toilets were no joke. In a place already filled with weapons, poison, and questionable food, the garderobe still manages to make the top 5 ways you might die while just trying to pee. A simple trip to the toilet becomes a balancing act over open sewage, a battle with hypothermia, and an existential crisis all in one. And when you finally shuffle back to bed frozen and forever changed, you'll find yourself whispering the same thing every castle resident has at some point. Why does everything in here want to kill me? You've made it this far alive if slightly traumatized. So you're starving. Time to eat. Surely the castle kitchen is a safe haven, right? A warm hearth, fresh bread, roasted meats. Wrong. Dinner in a medieval castle is just another trap wrapped in a crusty, possibly poisoned pie. You shuffle down to the great hall led by the smells of something vaguely edible. Inside, a massive wooden table groans under piles of meat trenchers, of stale bread pots, of stew, and jugs of ale. At first glance, it looks bountiful, but your modern stomach might not survive the truth. Let's start with the meat. It's probably been hanging for days, weeks, if it's winter. Medieval kitchens didn't have refrigeration. Instead, cooks relied on heavy salting, smoking, or brace yourself spices to mask the rot. That's right. If your roast tastes especially peppery, it might be because it's closer to jerky than beef. Some historians believe many noble families developed a taste for well-aged meat, like it was a delicacy. Others argue that they just didn't notice anymore, and don't expect forks. You're eating with your fingers, maybe a knife. Hygiene wasn't exactly high on the menu. Everyone at the table shares food from the same platters. Communal drinking cups common. Hand washing optional. Soap rare. That stew you're eyeing may contain more germs than ingredients. Quirky fact, sometimes people would use hollowed-out bread as plates called trenchers. After eating, they'd either feed them to dogs the poor or throw them out the window. Waste management. Let's just say, gravity did most of the work. Now let's talk about lead. You sip from your pewter mug, unaware that it might be lined with lead glaze. Drinking acidic wine from it that leaches lead into your bloodstream, giving you a lovely little dose of long-term neurological damage. But hey, at least it's not hot enough to melt the cup like those fancy French lead-based goblets. Progress. And about that bread you're tearing into, it might be maslin, a rough mix of wheat, barley, and rye. Cheap filling and occasionally toxic. Rye could harbor a fungus called ergot, a lovely little hallucinogen that caused convulsions, fever, and a charming tendency to feel like your limbs were on fire. Historians still argue whether outbreaks of dancing plague in medieval Europe were caused by this very bread. Dinner and a show. You're hoping for vegetables. Good luck. Most veggies were viewed with suspicion, especially raw ones. They were considered peasant food, or worse, windy, meaning they gave you gas and therefore insulted your noble dignity. Cooked greens were boiled to mush, then seasoned with vinegar, garlic, or more salt. So much salt. Oh, and dairy. If the milk hasn't spoiled by mid-morning, it's a miracle. Cheese was a safer bet, but it was hard strong and sometimes crawling with mites. And yet people still considered it healthy. You're chewing a wedge the size of a cobblestone, trying not to crunch anything that wasn't supposed to crunch. Here's a fun little dinner surprise: red dye in wine. Some nobles liked their drink dark and rich, so servants would add iron filings or animal blood to make it redder. Looks great in a goblet. Tastes like a sword. Food wasn't just risky, it was political. Where you sat at the table mattered. Who served you first mattered. If you were too important to be poisoned through open food, someone might try slipping something into your personal dish. This led to taste testers whose job was basically human guinea pig. So, if the squire keels over after nibbling your trout, maybe don't eat the trout. And let's not forget about kitchen fires. The castle kitchen was often its own building, or tucked in a lower courtyard because it burned down so often. Open hearths, grease, and flammable rushes on the floor meant that dinner could quickly become a 5-alarm disaster. Some castles installed early smoke vents or hoods above fireplaces, but most kitchens were smoke-choked rooms where you could barely see the wall, much less the fire creeping up your leg. Cooks had it the worst. Slippery stone floors, hot oil live animals roaming around, sharp knives everywhere, and all while working in total chaos. Burn injuries, smoke inhalation, and even exploding pots from building pressure inside sealed clay were common occupational hazards. The phrase, "too many cooks in the kitchen," wasn't a joke, it was a warning. Even the desserts were suspect. Want a tart might be made with honey, or sweetened with lead. Acetate, yes again with the lead, because it made fruits taste richer. Tired of lead. Try almond milk, which was neither almond nor milk, but a crushed nut slurry that fermented into an unpredictable paste. Delicious. And when the feast ended, the leftovers went everywhere, scraped into dog bowls, tossed out windows, dumped in the courtyard. Rats loved it. So did disease. So here you are chewing on possibly poisonous meat from a lead-lined dish, while seated between two people who haven't bathed in a month and just sneezed directly into the ale. One of them is coughing ominously, and you're wondering if that's just a cold or something more plaguey. Suddenly, skipping dinner doesn't sound so bad. Maybe just nibble on some of that stale bread. If it doesn't dance. You survived dinner. Barely. You're bloated, mildly poisoned, and deeply concerned about that tingling in your fingertips. Maybe it's just the cold. Or maybe it's the lead. Either way, you shuffle away from the great hall looking for fresh air, only to realize that the very air inside the castle is another hidden danger. Let's talk ventilation, or more accurately, the lack of it. Castles were built to keep invaders out, not to circulate a gentle breeze. The stone walls are 3 to 10 feet thick, the windows are arrow slits, and the only airflow comes from wherever the wind chooses to sneak in. The result, stale, smoky, humid rooms that trap everything from fireplace soot to body odor like it's precious cargo. You take a deep breath and immediately regret it. The smoky haze from the Great Hall's torches and fireplaces lingers in the corridors. Your lungs itch. Your eyes water. Some rooms had tiny chimney shafts, sure, but they rarely worked well. Smoke simply settled, rising in lazy spirals, collecting in the rafters, and then slowly drifting back down to mix with the aroma of unwashed linen and roast goose grease. Historians still argue whether castle architects genuinely thought about airflow, or if suffocating indoors was just an expected side effect of medieval luxury. Now factor in the sheer number of bodies inside the walls. Dozens, sometimes hundreds of people lived in close quarters, servants, soldiers, animals, nobles, guests. That meant coughing, sneezing, sweating, breathing, all trapped together in a giant stone oven, especially in winter when doors were kept shut and fires burned around the clock. You ever tried sleeping in a windowless room with a peat fire going and 12 other people snoring around you? The carbon monoxide levels alone could drop a horse, and sometimes did. Several old castle records mention mysterious sleeping sicknesses that swept through crowded quarters. Was it the plague, bad food, or just toxic air? We'll never know. And if it wasn't the fire trying to choke you, it was the pests, The walls themselves were alive with lice mites and the occasional flea circus. Tapestries helped insulate the cold stone, but also created nesting zones for insects. The floors were often covered in rushes, cut plants meant to soak up spills. Sounds rustic and cozy until you realize they weren't changed very often. Food scraps, animal dung, vomit, and other unmentionables would get mashed in. The smell didn't fade. It evolved. In summer, the castle became a sauna of scent. Everything intensified. The mold on the ceiling grew fuzzy with pride. Chamber pots overflowed. Mosquitoes spawned in rain barrels. The fresh air outside was often just slightly less horrific than the inside. You might find yourself climbing to the roof or battlements just to inhale something that didn't smell like medieval feet. There's also the matter of candles and torches. To light the hallways at night, tallow candles made from animal fat were used. Ever burned one of those? The smell is memorable. Combine it with low oxygen and closed doors, and you've basically got a medieval smokehouse for people. And the light itself, dim, flickering, and full of shadows, which is why so many people tripped, fell, or impaled themselves on something pointy, just trying to find the kitchen. Oddly enough, castle builders sometimes added holes in unexpected places to help air things out. Small slits called louver boards in the ceiling of halls could vent smoke upward. Some turrets had concealed gaps to draw air through, but these were experimental at best. Most of the time, ventilation was achieved by opening a door and hoping the wind didn't blow the fire out or the chamber pot over. There's even evidence that chimney explosions happened. That's right, fireplaces were known to backdraft violently if wind patterns shifted or if soot blocked the flue. One wrong gust, and your cozy fire becomes a medieval flamethrower. You're trying to warm your hands 1 minute, and the next you're flapping your sleeves while screaming. For the wealthy, things were marginally better. Lords and ladies might have private chambers with higher ceilings and slightly better circulation. Maybe a window with wooden shutters. Maybe. But even then, the air quality was rough. Which is probably why so many nobles walked around holding scented pomanders, tiny balls filled with herbs and spices. Some were just trying not to gag. Others believed the pleasant smells would protect them from disease. Spoiler, they didn't. Quirky detail time, castle architects occasionally added wind eyes, small, high openings in towers designed to let drafts pass through. That's right, there was an actual term for holes that did little more than let cold air slap you in the face. Progress. You'd think with all the candles and fires they'd invent a better system for airflow. But no. Most castles simply absorbed the smoke and smell. The stones turned black with soot. The ceilings dripped tar. The air got heavier the longer you stayed. It's like the building itself was exhaling. And yet, despite all this, people lived here for years. Children were born, songs were sung, goats were milked, and treaties were signed, all while inhaling a noxious cocktail of smoke, sweat, mold, and something suspiciously like turnip. So the next time you complain about allergies in your modern apartment, just remember at least your kitchen fan won't spontaneously catch fire and launch a flaming raccoon at you. Probably, you've had your meal choked on the air and survived the medieval restroom experience. At this point, you're probably hoping for a little peace and quiet. Maybe some fresh bread and a walk in the courtyard. But not today. Today, the castle is under siege. And that, dear listener, is when things get really bad. Castles were built for defense, yes. But when enemies came knocking, usually with catapults, ladders, and a lot of very angry men, the castle quickly went from fortress to coffin. Once the gates were barred and the drawbridge raised, the real suffering began. For the people inside. Let's set the mood. You're sitting in the courtyard when the warning bell starts ringing. Horns blare. Archers rush to the battlements. The Lord shouts something about holding fast. You rush to a window or arrow slit and peek out. There they are, dozens or hundreds of troops outside your walls. Banners raised, siege towers rolling. You're about to get very, very familiar with boredom, hunger, and things falling from the sky. First problem, food. Castles kept some emergency stores. Grain-dried meats, maybe salted fish if the Lord had foresight. But most relied on the surrounding farmland, which you no longer have access to. The second those gates close, the food clock starts ticking, and it ticks fast. Bread goes moldy, meat runs out, the chickens get eaten, then the dogs, then the rats. Starvation is one of the slowest, cruelest ways to die in a siege. People get desperate. People get creative. A few records from particularly brutal medieval sieges describe people eating grass, leather boots, even wall mortar. Yes, rocks. One siege in France allegedly ended when defenders began boiling the bodies of the dead. Whether that's true or just enemy propaganda, historians still argue. Water also a problem. Some castles had wells inside the walls. Smart, unless that well gets poisoned. Enemies sometimes catapulted carcasses, animal and human, over the walls just to contaminate the water supply. And yes, disease usually followed. Dysentery, typhus, cholera, these weren't just distant worries. They were in your bucket. Sieges could last days, weeks, months. And the longer they dragged on, the more unstable things got inside. Tempers flared. Fights broke out. People hoarded food, spread rumors, pointed fingers. There's one charming account of a baker being stoned to death by villagers for hiding flour. Solid community bonding moment. Meanwhile, outside the walls, the enemy wasn't just waiting. They were throwing things. Flaming barrels, dead livestock, rocks the size of ox carts. And if they had a trebuchet, oh boy, you were in for some high-flying nightmare fuel. These gravity-powered machines could hurl massive projectiles with terrifying precision. Some even launched diseased corpses' heads, or because medieval people loved a good scare tactic, bags of live snakes. And don't expect the castle walls to hold forever. Over time, battering rams can crack gates. Undermining teams might try to tunnel beneath the foundations and cause a full wall collapse. You could be napping in your chamber and suddenly find yourself waking up in a trench full of very confused invaders. Even when things seemed quiet, there was danger. Siege ladders were stealthy and fast. Enemies could be climbing the outer walls before you even noticed. The defender's job, push them back, throw rocks, pour boiling water or oil if you were wealthy on them. But in the chaos, many defenders slipped, fell, or got taken out by their own comrades. There's nothing quite like being hit in the head with a rock from your own side. And don't forget, fire arrows. One lucky shot into the castle roof, and now you're trying to fight flames and enemies. Remember, castle interiors are full of wood rushes and fabric. One spark and the whole place turns into a bonfire with really bad air circulation. There's even evidence of traitors inside the walls. Servants bribed to open a gate, or desperate townsfolk letting down ropes in the night. You had to trust your neighbors. And when food was low and death was near, that trust wore thin fast. Want a quirky siege fact? In 1326, attackers used a cart full of bees, yes, bees, as a biological weapon. They launched the hive over the wall, hoping the chaos would buy them time to breach the gate. Did it work? Maybe. Did everyone inside remember that forever? Definitely. And while all this is happening, you, the average castle dweller, have nowhere to hide. You huddle in cellars, under stone arches, or in the chapel, hoping the roof holds and that someone remembered to bolt the side door. You flinch at every rumble. You try to sleep while rocks crash, babies cry, and a goat chews someone's boot. Sometimes siege defenders were starved into surrender. Other times they launched desperate counterattacks out the sally port, a tiny hidden door for surprise raids. Did these work occasionally? But usually they just gave the attackers a new pile of corpses to throw back over the wall. When the siege finally ends, if it ends, it's not usually with a celebration. It's with fireblood or slow surrender. Survivors stumble out, half-starved, ash-covered, and whispering oaths never to go back. And then the walls are rebuilt, the gates are repaired, and the next poor souls move in. So if you ever fantasize about living in a castle, remember during a siege, your best-case scenario is running out of food slowly. Worst case, you get trebucheted to death by your own dinner. You've survived the siege barely. You're sleep-deprived, probably missing a few teeth, and you haven't seen clean water in days. But the fighting's over. The gates creak open, and you limp to the nearest well, desperate for a drink. Bad idea. See, in a medieval castle, the well, that humble hole in the ground you assumed was a lifesaver, might just be your ticket to the afterlife. As it turns out, water in the Middle Ages was a bit like modern Wi-Fi, absolutely essential, but incredibly unreliable. Let's start with the basics. Most castles were smart enough to build wells inside their walls. After all, if you're going to be locked in for months during a siege, you'll need something to drink. Rain barrels were helpful, sure, but a deep stone-lined well, that was gold. Unless, of course, it collapsed, or dried up, or got poisoned, which happened a lot. Wells were usually dug right down to the water table, sometimes 100 feet deep or more. Impressive, yes. But medieval digging wasn't exactly OSHA compliant. Some collapsed mid-dig, trapping and killing workers. Others crumbled decades later, sometimes right under the kitchen or courtyard. You'd be walking along and suddenly, boom, you're in a well, broken ankles and all. But structural danger wasn't the only issue. The real threat, contamination. Castles were packed with people, soldiers, servants, animals, nobles, visitors, rats. And where there are people, there is waste. Latrines emptied into cesspits. Cesspits leaked. Rain carried filth down stone channels. And if your well wasn't far enough from the toilet, congratulations, you're drinking from the same water that rinsed your lord's bottom. And yes, cholera, dysentery, and typhoid were rampant. It's a miracle anyone lived past 20. Now, during sieges, the well was a target. Attacking forces couldn't always breach the walls, but they could spoil your supply. How simple, just toss a few rotting corpses or dead livestock over the walls and let nature do the rest. If the well was open air, and many were, it didn't take much to turn it into a putrid soup. One famous account from the siege of Chateau Gaillard in 1203 described attackers catapulting the bodies of disease victims directly into the castle's water source. According to some reports, the stench alone caused people to flee parts of the fortress. Although, to be fair, historians still argue whether that actually happened or was medieval propaganda with extra flair. And don't forget, sabotage from within. A treacherous servant or desperate prisoner might poison the well from the inside. arsenic, hemlock, powdered glass, whatever was on hand. Granted, many of those poisons wouldn't be detectable in a cold cup of water until, well, after you drank it. Even in peacetime, water quality was dicey. Wells could be shallow or dug too close to animal pens. One quirky record from a Scottish castle describes the lord blaming his headaches on demon-haunted waters when it was more likely just sheep urine. So what did people do? Boil their water? Not often. Boiling meant fuel, and fuel was expensive. Firewood had to be chopped, dried, stored, and constantly fed. People weren't going to waste it on water unless they were already sick. Instead, they often turned to beer and ale. Weak, low-alcohol brews were safer than water because the brewing process killed bacteria. Even children drank it. In fact, castle kitchens often brewed enormous barrels of small beer just for daily hydration. It wasn't tasty, but it didn't make you vomit blood, so win. But that didn't eliminate the need for water entirely. Cooking, washing, extinguishing fires all still required it. So even the cleanest medieval castles had water teams. Men, and often boys, tasked with drawing buckets, cleaning out troughs, and occasionally climbing into the well itself to clear blockages. Which was horrifying, because medieval wells were dark, slippery, and sometimes home to eels, frogs, or worse. There's one record of a well diver in the 14th century who got stuck at the bottom when his rope frayed. He survived by clinging to a slimy ledge until help arrived 2 days later. That story ends with a promotion, but also lifelong trauma. Fun. Oh, and let's talk accidents. Wells didn't always have protective walls or lids. Kids fell in. So did goats. So did drunks. Some even tried to hide things in Wells jewelry, money, stolen apples, only to lose them forever. More than one court record from the time includes a line like "Item 1 silver ring lost in the old stone well during Midsummer's Eve." And yes, the ring was never recovered. In times of extreme paranoia, castles would seal off the well entirely and rely on rain barrels, but these ran out fast, and rainwater collected from the same roofs, birds used as toilets, wasn't exactly safe either. By now, you're probably thinking, okay, I'll just drink bottled water. Good luck. Bottles were made of glass or leather, and most of them smelled like the last thing they held vinegar fish oil or soup. So here you are, surrounded by stone arrows and stale bread. You finally find a moment of peace, lower a bucket into the well, and take a long, grateful sip, and it tastes like rotten cabbage and regret. You jolt awake in the middle of the night, the distant crackle of flames tugging at your half-dreaming mind. No, it's not the hearth. Something's burning. And in a medieval castle, that means one thing. Everything is about to go horribly wrong. Let's clear up one myth right away. Castles were made of stone, but they burned all the time. Why? Because the stone was just the shell. Inside, you had floors of dry timber, woolen tapestries, hay-stuffed bedding, reed thatching, oil lamps, pitch torches, cooking fires, and those were just the planned fire hazards. Add in a gust of wind, an overturned candle, or a drunken guest knocking over a brazier, and congratulations, your fortress just became a fireball. Medieval people lived with fire like we live with electricity, constantly. You cooked with it, warmed with it, lit your way with it. And if you were feeling festive, used it in torches for nighttime jousts. That last one might sound dramatic, but yes, flaming torches and banners were a thing. A very flammable thing. Now imagine you're up in a wooden watchtower during one of these torch-lit festivities. Suddenly, the wind shifts. That fluttering banner catches, and within seconds, you're inside a chimney. Even when things weren't actively on fire, smoke was everywhere. Most rooms didn't have chimneys, so fires vented through holes in the ceiling cracks in the wall, or not at all. You'd wake up coughing, your hair smelling like bacon fat, and your eyes stinging from the night before. Think smoky dive bar meets indoor campsite. Why not just open a window, you ask? Well, for starters, most windows didn't have glass. They were covered with cloth shutters, or if you were fancy thin slices of horn. Opening one in winter meant freezing. And in summer bugs. Lots of them. So people learned to live with smoke. Sort of. Historians still argue whether castle dwellers developed any kind of effective ventilation system. Some castles, like the famed Crack des Chevaliers, had clever air channels to draw smoke up and out. Others just didn't. The result, chronic lung problems, coughing fits, and walls permanently stained with soot. And we haven't even gotten to actual fires yet. Most castle fires weren't caused by enemy action. They were accidents, a kitchen blaze that got out of hand, a spark from a fireplace landing on a rug, or someone trying to dry wet boots too close to a flame. There's one delightful 13th century account of a knight who fell asleep while drying his trousers over a fire and woke up half naked and hairless. His beard apparently never grew back right. But when attackers did want to burn a castle down, they had options. Siege engines could hurl fire pots, clay vessels filled with pitch resin and oil over the walls. If they hit something flammable, the fire would spread fast. Some even used dead animals soaked in fat as medieval Molotovs. Gross, absolutely. Effective, terrifyingly so. Then there was Greek fire, a mysterious Byzantine invention that burned even on water. Castles along coastal routes dreaded it. No one fully understands its exact formula, though historians love to guess, but imagine being doused in what looks like liquid tar that won't stop burning. There's no polite way to handle that. In peacetime, castle staff developed what we might generously call fire safety protocols. That meant a few things: keeping water barrels nearby, limiting fires to central hearths, and having servants watch flames through the night. But servants were tired. They dozed. Fires flared. One fringe theory claims certain castle guards used cats as early warning systems. Cats would flee a smoky room faster than humans. There's no hard evidence for this, but it's kind of charming to imagine a knight waking up because whiskers bolted from the fireplace. Now, if your castle did catch fire, your options were bleak. There were no organized fire brigades. Buckets of water had to be hauled from the well, remember that thing from earlier, and carried up narrow staircases. In a panic, people tossed water on oil fires, threw bedding out the window, or tried smothering flames with damp cloaks. The worst fires spread vertically, because castle interiors had multiple levels with wooden beams and trapdoors. Fire could leap from floor to floor like it had a grudge. A spark in the kitchen could become a full inferno in the Lord's chamber upstairs in minutes. And if the roof was thatch, well, say goodbye. Oh, and here's a fun fact. Roofs were often coated in pitch to help shed rain, which also happens to be extremely flammable. So yes, your anti-weather coating was basically medieval lighter fluid. Even castle defenses were vulnerable. The hoardings, those wooden walkways that jutted out above the walls to let defenders shoot down, were made of timber. One flaming arrow, and your best defensive feature became a tinderbox. Fire in the hoardings often meant the defenders had to abandon their positions, letting attackers get closer. And let's not forget the psychological toll. You're stuck in a cold, damp fortress surrounded by stone, plagued by illness and rats. And now fire, the one thing keeping you warm, is also your greatest threat. People lived in a constant dance with the flame, close enough to benefit, never so close you caught it. Still, there were some innovations. By the late Middle Ages, wealthier castles began installing proper chimneys. These were tall, narrow, and made of stone, helping direct smoke out and reduce accidental fires. They also became status symbols: show off your chimney, show off your coin. But even then, fire wasn't done. Lightning could strike, tapestries could ignite, and there's that 1421 story of a jester who tried juggling candles and nearly burned down the entire Great Hall. He was banned from fire tricks permanently, and possibly from juggling. So here you sit, huddled near your carefully tended flame, knowing full well it could betray you at any moment. Do you trust it? Do you smother it? Or do you lie awake, staring at the rafters and whisper one last bedtime thought? Please don't let me burn tonight. You wake up coughing. Again. The smoke from last night's fire still lingers in your lungs, and the damp stone around you offers no comfort. You stretch, but your arms ache from yesterday's efforts, and today's task might be worse. Because today you're headed to the castle kitchen. Now you might think a medieval kitchen is just a big stone room where someone roasts a pig over a fire. That's not wrong. But it's also only the beginning of what could be one of the most hazardous zones in the entire fortress. First off, the kitchen is separated from the main keep whenever possible. That's not out of concern for your lungs. It's to prevent the entire castle from burning down. Remember those flammable thatched roofs and timber frames? Fire and food didn't mix well unless you were actively trying to evacuate a castle. But if your kitchen was attached to the castle, as was often the case in winter, congratulations. You've just signed up for open flames, boiling pots, butchered animals, and sharp knives flying in every direction. And if you're one of the unlucky dozens working in this smoky inferno, hope you're fast on your feet. The chaos starts early. Fires are lit before dawn using wood soaked in lard or oil to burn hotter. Huge iron cauldrons hang over flames ready to boil meats, stews, or grains. There are no temperature gauges, just instinct and the occasional burned eyebrow. You think a modern kitchen gets crowded during the dinner rush? Try navigating around 3 scullions peeling onions, 2 bakers kneading dough, someone chasing a runaway goose, and the cook shrieking because someone dropped a salted eel into the fire. Again. And let's talk about those eels. Castle kitchens didn't serve burgers and fries. They churned out elaborate meals that followed strict medieval dietary laws and church fasting rules. No meat on Fridays, no problem. Just whip up some almond milk pottage, a peacock glazed in egg yolk, or a pie full of live blackbirds. Yes, that nursery rhyme wasn't entirely fiction. You're elbow deep in spiced rabbit stew when someone yells that the Lord's hunting party is returning. That's your cue to drop everything, clear the table, and prepare for the nobility's feast, which, by the way, might include 25 separate dishes. And you thought your job at the food court was stressful. Now imagine doing all of this with zero refrigeration. Meat spoils fast. Fish spoils faster. Even milk could turn sour by noon, if not kept in the cellar. So cooks relied heavily on spices not to mask rot, as some outdated myths suggest, but to flaunt wealth. Cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg, these weren't cheap. They were culinary flexes, proof that your lord could afford imports from across the known world. But even if your ingredients were fresh, your kitchen tools were medieval. Imagine cutting veggies with a dull iron knife, frying on a pan that weighs more than your dog, and stirring stew with a wooden spoon the size of a canoe paddle. Burn your hand, no ice. Just wrap it in a damp cloth and keep working. Infection, prey. Historians still argue whether kitchens were genuinely respected workplaces or grim punishment zones for the unlucky. Some records suggest skilled cooks were highly valued. Others show servants rotated through the kitchen as penance for minor crimes. Broke a plate. Congrats, you're gutting pigs tomorrow. And let's not forget the great medieval rats. Oh yes. With open food drippings and leftovers in every corner, castle kitchens were paradise for rodents. Some castles even kept cats or terriers on staff just to chase them. There's a surviving inventory from a 14th century English manor listing 2 mousers with collars among the kitchen tools. The worst part, sanitation. There was none. Raw meat, blood feathers, grease all swirling around your feet while you cook. Floors were rarely washed and flies were considered part of the ambiance. You might be making a beautiful frumenty for the Lord's banquet, but next to you, a chicken is being beheaded on the same wooden slab where you just rolled out dough. You wipe sweat from your brow only to realize it's not sweat, it's duck fat from the ceiling beam. Lovely. Oh, and remember how ovens worked? Massive clay or stone structures had to be preheated with wood, then swept clean of embers before baking could begin. Timing was crucial. Too soon and your bread came out doughy. Too late and you were gnawing on charcoal. The baker, often a separate role, was a figure both loved and feared. If the bread came out well, he was praised. If it burned, the entire household might grumble. If it exploded, yes, sometimes trapped air caused whole loaves to rupture. You'd better hope no one important saw it. Let's say, though, that somehow your meal turns out perfect. The roasted boar is golden. The wine is flowing. The table groans under the weight of carved fruit and sugar sculptures. The noble family dines in grandeur. And you're behind a curtain nibbling stale crusts, waiting to wash 300 dishes in a wooden tub of greasy water. Hope you enjoy soggy fingers and the faint scent of pickled cabbage. Still, you find brief joy in the madness. The camaraderie of cooks, the rhythm of chopping and stirring the pride when the roast turns out just right. But it doesn't last. Someone just dropped the stew, again. And someone else tripped over a dog flinging hot porridge onto the walls. The Lord bellows for dessert. Someone yells for more firewood. And you, clutching a pan as big as your torso, realize one brutal truth. This kitchen is trying to kill you. You've barely stepped out of the kitchen, still smelling like burnt barley and goose grease, when you spot something dart across the corridor floor. Was it a shadow? A rat? A particularly ambitious chicken? Nope, just another castle resident you didn't ask for. Because here's the thing, you're not alone in this fortress. Not by a long shot. And many of your roommates are smaller, furrier, and far more infectious than you'd like. Medieval castles weren't sterile palaces. They were living, wheezing, scratching ecosystems. And some of the biggest threats weren't soldiers or assassins. They were fleas, rats, roaches, birds, goats. And yes, even the occasional monkey. Let's start with the rodents. If you think rats are gross, now imagine them in a world where trash was tossed out the window, meat was hung in warm pantries, and there was no such thing as a mousetrap. These weren't shy little nibblers. They were bold, scrappy invaders who scurried between storerooms and bedrooms like they owned the place. And in many ways they did. Some castles even had rat catchers on staff, complete with ferrets or little dogs trained to dart into cracks and drag the squealers out. Still they came, and with them came fleas, and with fleas came, plague. Historians still argue whether the Black Death came mainly from fleas on rats, fleas on humans, or infected grain shipments. But regardless, castles were not immune. In fact, their closed walls, close quarters, and heavy foot traffic made them prime breeding grounds. One sniffle in the Great Hall could lead to a full-on outbreak. Your odds of survival slimmer than the thread holding up your tunic. But it wasn't just pests you hated, it was pets you loved. Nobles adored exotic animals. Falcons perched indoors. Monkeys were tied to bedposts. There's even record of a French lord who owned a polar bear which lived in the moat on a leash and was fed fish. Charming, until it escapes. Now picture this, a peacock strutting across the dining table, a mastiff snarling at your ankles, and a goose that keeps attacking everyone who smells like cheese. Add a few parrots squawking in Latin, and you've basically got the original medieval petting zoo, but with a lot more danger and a lot less hand sanitizer. Worse, the animals didn't just roam the halls. They shared your space. Chickens lived in kitchens. Goats were sometimes kept indoors to protect them from thieves. Cats slept on your blanket. Dogs tracked mud, and worse, across your straw mattress. And when nature called, there were no designated pet areas. It's all dirt floors, wooden planks, and chamber pots. Cleanliness, let's say, was flexible. In this mess, lice were inevitable. Tiny, itchy, and utterly committed to ruining your day. Hair washing was rare, especially in winter, and delousing was a regular social activity. Sit near the fire, chat picnits from your neighbor's scalp. Friendship goals. The castle also had uninvited wildlife. Bats fluttered in rafters. Spiders hung from beams. Birds nested between the roof slates. Insects swarmed in summer, and flies buzzed constantly near kitchens, latrines, and garbage piles. You swatted them with whatever was nearby your hand, your cloak sometimes a ladle. One quirky tidbit, frogs in the water barrels. No joke. Some households believed a frog placed inside a water cask kept it fresh longer. Whether this worked or not is questionable, but it did mean you might get a mouthful of webbed leg with your drink. And let's not forget the human element. The people around you could be just as hazardous as the pests. Bathing wasn't a daily ritual. It was an event. Maybe monthly. Maybe only for holidays. So everyone smelled a little historic. Add in rotting teeth, open sores, and mystery rashes, and suddenly, that packed feast hall feels more like a petri dish than a party. Sanitation. In a medieval sense, often meant tossing slop out a window and praying no one was underneath. Floors were covered with rushes, straw, or herbs laid down to soak up spills. Sounds nice. Think again. Those rushes were rarely cleaned. Layers of food filth and flea eggs built up like lasagna. In one castle, archaeologists found 20 layers of rushes in a single chamber, complete with preserved rat droppings. But you try not to think about that as you step into the chapel for some peace and quiet. A bird flutters past the stained glass. You kneel and immediately feel something crawl up your sock. Don't scream. Just smile, nod, and pretend the sacred space isn't doubling as a nesting ground. Now you might be wondering, why didn't they do more to fix this? Well, some did. Wealthier castles had separate guardrobes, toilets to draw pests away from sleeping quarters. Cats were valued Mausers, Certain herbs, lavender, mint, rosemary, were scattered across floors to repel bugs and mask odors. Even medieval bed linens were boiled occasionally. Still, the problem was scale. Hundreds of people, dozens of animals, one confined space. Every time someone sneezed, spilled grain, or cracked open a salted herring barrel, they invited another little guest. And so, as you crawl into bed tonight, surrounded by whispers and creaks, and the unmistakable scratching of tiny claws in the walls, you realize this castle isn't just a home. It's a wildlife sanctuary that absolutely does not want you to live. Sleep tight. You're awoken not by birdsong, but by bells, loud, insistent, echoing through every corridor of stone. And no, they're not summoning you to a feast. They're calling you to war. You bolt upright. Boots thud in the hallway. Shouts rise from the courtyard. Outside your window, slit smoke spirals into the morning sky. You hear the drawbridge chains clanking into motion, the clamor of hooves, and the spine-chilling crack of a horn. The castle is under siege, and you, for better or worse, are inside it. Now, in peacetime, castles feel heavy but safe. In wartime, they become fortresses in the truest sense, locked down, braced for the long haul, and prepared to turn every stone and stairwell into a weapon. First things first, shut the gates. If the outer bailey isn't already swarming with enemy soldiers, defenders rush to raise the drawbridge and drop the portcullis, a heavy iron gate with teeth like a bear trap. There might even be a second portcullis behind the first, so any invaders who sneak in get trapped in a deadly metal sandwich. The enemy doesn't wait. You hear the whump of catapults launching boulders, the thunderclap of siege engines battering outer walls. Flaming arrows streak overhead, setting the barn roof ablaze. And all the while, knights prepare for the worst. You're ushered to your assigned station, not a sword in hand, but a bucket. Because if the fire spreads, your job is to put it out. Welcome to medieval firefighting bucket brigades, wet blankets, and prayers. Above you, soldiers scramble to the battlements. They pour sand to cushion against incoming stones. They ready crossbows. They set up boiling oil, or more often heated sand or quicklime, which was cheaper and still devastating. From murder holes in the machicolation's stone projections above the gate, defenders drop nastiness on anyone who gets too close. You find yourself pressed into the wall, watching, as a stone the size of a carriage crashes through a tower, sending debris raining down. You wince. Someone probably died in that collapse. There's no time to mourn. In the chapel, monks kneel in frantic prayer. In the keep, noblewomen direct servants to stockpile food and seal doors. Everyone has a job, even children. Some carry messages, some bring water. All know the risk, because sieges weren't short. Some lasted months. The enemy didn't always storm the walls. They surrounded them, starved the castle out, cut supply lines, poisoned nearby wells. So within the castle, rations begin immediately. Bread, beans, dried fish, nothing fresh, water's limited. Wine maybe, but even the nobility drink it sparingly now. The worst part, you can't leave. No more foraging. No fresh air. The gates stay locked. And so every breath in the great hall carries the scent of fierce sweat and chamber pots that can't be emptied. As the days wear on, you notice signs of desperation. Rats, once pests, are now considered protein. Dogs vanish. Cats vanish. You hear whispers of a stolen pigeon, and you're not entirely sure it was for companionship. One night, the enemy tries to breach the wall with a battering ram. The noise shakes the stone. You're assigned to roll barrels of rock down the stairwell if they make it through. Your job is to crush them under weight and luck. You grip the barrel. It's heavy, but not as heavy as what's at stake. But they don't break through. Not yet. Still cracks appear. Morale begins to splinter. Someone is accused of stealing food and beaten. Someone else tries to escape over the walls. His broken body is hauled back by the ankle. Even laughter, once a sign of defiance, grows rare. You notice who's losing hope. But there's one thing no one ever forgets. This castle was built for this. Every tower is a vantage point. Every spiral staircase narrows clockwise to favor right-handed defenders. Every tiny slit of a window becomes a deadly archer's perch. And as time goes on, the defenders find rhythm. The garrison rotates, shifts. The smiths mend weapons. Messengers sneak out at night to plead for reinforcements. Meanwhile, you learn resilience. How to sleep through screams. How to ration stale bread. How to recognize the whistle of a trebuchet stone before it hits. Then suddenly quiet. No horns, no arrows, no catapult strikes. You creep to the walls, peer over, and find the enemy. Gone. They've retreated. Why? Maybe sickness struck their camp. Maybe they heard reinforcements were coming. Maybe the siege just cost too much. No one cares. You're alive. People erupt into sobs, prayers, embraces. The Lord bellows thanks to heaven. Bells ring again, but now in celebration. The castle breathes for the first time in weeks. But even in victory, you see the cost: a collapsed tower, scorched roofs, a grave pit in the courtyard. Friends lost, food gone, hope dented. Still, you survived one of the harshest tests a medieval life could throw at you, a siege from within the walls. And now, you're hungry, ragged, and exhausted, but somehow stronger than before. Welcome back to the living. You're still catching your breath from the siege when someone beckons you down a quiet, torch-lit hallway behind the chapel. A narrow stairwell descends deep into the belly of the keep, far below the bustle of rebuilding, far from the sunlight. It smells of mildew, rust, and something sharp. And as your eyes adjust, you realize where you are: the dungeon. Now, if you think dungeons were just for criminals and wartime prisoners, think again. This dark, windowless pit has swallowed plenty of castle residents, not all of them on purpose. Sometimes you get pushed in, other times you just fall. The castle's dungeon isn't some romantic movie set with neatly lined cells and chatty guards. No, this is a half-flooded, rat-infested crypt of stone iron and very bad decisions. The walls drip with condensation. Shackles dangle from hooks like silent warnings. There's even a bottle dungeon, basically a giant pit you're dropped into by rope or ladder, which is then removed. You're trapped in total darkness with no ladder, no toilet, no hope. And guess what? That trapdoor in the Lord's Hall above the feast table. Yep, sometimes it leads straight here. So if a noble got a little too tipsy or political, he might wake up somewhere with more chains and fewer cheese platters. Even when the dungeon wasn't in use, it was always there. A quiet reminder to behave. A psychological shadow lurking beneath the most lavish throne. Historians still argue whether torture was truly as widespread as pop culture claims. But records show many castles had at least some instruments of persuasion. The rack, the Iron Maiden, heated tongs. Not always in use, but always ready. And here's where it gets quirkier. In some places, torture was more bureaucratic. They might just make you stand for hours in an awkward position while being questioned repeatedly. It was more about mental collapse than physical mutilation. Still, the threat was real enough to keep lips sealed and rebellion rare. Yet it wasn't just enemies who ended up here. Servants, jesters, even rival heirs, anyone who fell out of favor could be tossed into the dark. Sometimes just for a few days, other times years. Imagine living your whole life just one floor above such a place, never knowing who might be down there, or whether you'd be next. The castle wasn't just a home, it was a hierarchy of fear, and the dungeon wasn't the only danger hiding in plain sight. There were trapdoors set into the floor of passageways, concealed pits lined with spikes, originally for invaders, but just as often triggered accidentally by overzealous guards or unlucky guests, especially those who wandered around with a goblet in hand after hours. And remember those narrow stairwells? If someone took a fall and you happened to be walking behind them, let's just say gravity doesn't care about rank. Even celebration could turn fatal. One infamous story tells of a victorious lord who ordered barrels of wine opened for a feast, only to have half the guests poisoned accidentally, or otherwise no one's sure. The surviving cook vanished. It wasn't all traps and terror, of course. Sometimes these shadowy places became storage for valuables, hidden treasures, even escape tunnels. But if you're thinking of exploring one, don't. Secret passages might seem glamorous, but they were death traps in disguise. Cramped, unlit, and prone to cave-ins, these escape routes were often forgotten by the next generation, or sealed up after a noble used one for an affair, a theft, or a traitorous midnight stroll. Worse, some of them led outside the walls, yes, but into the middle of enemy camps, or over cliff edges, or into old latrines. People did die in them, collapsed, lost, suffocated. Still, you're curious, aren't you? Maybe you sneak down one night. Maybe the air feels colder the deeper you go. Maybe your torch flickers near a fork in the path. And maybe, just maybe, you hear a voice that's not yours, echoing from the dark. You turn back, because now you understand a castle is like a great stone beast. Majestic, yes. Powerful. Protective. But inside, it's all teeth and guts and narrow spaces that don't care who you are. So whether you're a prisoner or a prince, all it takes is one wrong step, and the castle swallows you whole. After the siege, after the darkness of the dungeon, after you've seen the castle's worst, something begins to change. The air tastes different, softer, more alive, because it's spring now. And with spring comes the return of color, sound, and celebration. The gray stone world you've been surviving in begins to blossom with banners, blossoms, and ballads. No longer merely a fortress or a tomb, the castle becomes what it always claimed to be in peace. A center of culture, ceremony, and courtly drama. And today, there's going to be a tournament. Not a battle, a show. A demonstration of skill and splendor, and yes, a few bruises, because nothing delights the medieval nobility more than controlled chaos, where someone might get a concussion in the name of honor. The outer bailey is transformed. Wooden bleachers are erected. Flags flap in the breeze. Minstrels warm up their lutes. Children race underfoot with flower garlands and bread crusts. Merchants wheel in carts full of sweets, honeyed almonds, candied violets, grilled skewers dripping with juices. And then come the knights, on horseback, in armor, shining, your breath catches. Not because they're gods, some of them are limping under all that plate, but because they look like the idea of knighthood carved into motion. Their coats of arms blaze across silk banners. Their lances are painted. Even their horses are armored in leather or quilted cloth. This isn't war, this is theater. The tournament opens with a parade, each knight riding past the nobles' gallery, saluting the lord of the castle, and most importantly, choosing a lady to dedicate their combat to. This can mean anything from romantic admiration to naked political maneuvering. You watch a knight single out a noblewoman with a rose-colored veil. He nods. She smiles. Somewhere nearby, her husband goes very still. Once the pageantry ends, the fighting begins. First, there's melee on foot, blunted swords, armored men, and a chaotic scrum of swinging, bashing, grappling. The goal: show strength, skill, and control, not kill your opponent. Though accidents happen, one man leaves the field clutching a broken collarbone. The crowd cheers. Then come the jousts. 2 riders, one narrow tilt barrier between them, a single lance each. The signal drops. They charge. The thunder of hooves, the roar of the crowd, the sickening crack of wood as lances splinter on shields or sometimes on helmets. One rider unseats the other, who hits the dirt hard. He groans, dazed, but rises. Victory is claimed. The fallen is helped to his feet, and a cheer erupts, not for the winner, but for the honor of both. This is more than sport. This is status theater. Every strike is a message. Every color, every gesture carries meaning. Some knights display mercy to gain favor. Others fight like they're proving something darker. Between events, entertainers keep the crowd roaring. Jugglers toss knives. Dwarves in motley perform lewd dances. A fire eater almost sets a tent alight. In a corner, a trained bear tugs on a chain and growls. You eat roasted meat off a trencher of stale bread. You sip spiced wine. You laugh at a puppet show mocking a bishop. And then comes the final event, the grand melee. Dozens of knights, 2 teams, 1 field. A glorious, galloping, absurd display of charging, crashing, shouting, and falling. Standards wave. Horses veer. Helmets dent. Blunted swords rise and fall. Mud flies. Men tumble. In the end, only a few remain standing, panting, grinning, bleeding slightly from the nose. One is crowned victor and receives a token from the lady he honored. A ribbon, a kiss, or in one scandalous case, a glove tucked discreetly into his belt. The crowd thins, the sun sets, but the night is just beginning. Because after the tournament comes the feast. Tables groan under the weight of game pies, sweetmeats, and wine. Nobles toast the victors. Musicians play. Dancers whirl. You're pulled into a ring and spun until you're dizzy. Someone places a crown of leaves on your head. You're too tired to protest. The Lord makes a speech. The hall quiets. He names the tourney's champion, praises the castle's resilience after the siege, and thanks the heavens for peace. The people cheer. You raise your cup with them, and in this golden moment you realize, for all its hardships, all its darkness, all its danger, the medieval world could also be breathtaking, raucous, beautiful, terrifying, tender. It wasn't just mud and war and silence. It was music and color and the sound of hundreds of voices shouting a knight's name as he rides past with a ribbon fluttering from his helm. And in that noise, for the first time, you feel joy. But don't get too comfortable, because remember, this castle still wants you dead. You wake the next morning in a haze of sore muscles, half-remembered lute songs, and the faint smell of spilled mead on your borrowed tunic. Somewhere outside, a rooster crows and then abruptly stops thanks to the cook's axe. Breakfast is coming. You stretch, bones clicking. You survived the tournament. You survived the siege. You even survived the bathroom. So surely, finally, you're safe. Right. Well, let's talk about your job. You've been lingering like a guest, but medieval castles weren't hotels. They were machines, and everyone had a role. Especially now, after a big event like a feast. And the truth is, most of those roles were dangerous. Take the kitchen staff. You step into the smoke-darkened scullery, and it's immediately hotter than the surface of the sun. Giant hearths roar. Pans clang. Someone's elbow deep in pastry dough. Someone else is turning a whole boar on a spit large enough to roast you and your bad decisions. One scullion boy is red-faced, coughing hard from inhaling flour dust. Another slices his thumb and gets smacked for bleeding near the venison. Burn marks, knife cuts, fire hazards, they're daily here. A spilled ladle of boiling lard has sent more than one cook screaming to the castle's rudimentary infirmary. Then there's the laundry crew sweating over cauldrons of scalding water, beating tunics with wooden paddles, and trying not to inhale too much of the lye soap that strips your skin nearly raw. One wrong step and you're slipping on wet stone or scalding your legs. What about the mason tasked with inspecting crumbling battlements? He works suspended over open air with no harness, no hard hat, and no insurance. Just don't fall is the safety manual. Even the jester prancing around with bells on isn't safe. Cross the wrong noble with a bad joke, and it's not just tomatoes you're dodging, it's exile stocks, or worse. A jest at the wrong person's expense could end your career or your life. Animal handlers walk a risky line between performance and peril. Feeding the Lord's falcons, that means enduring slashing talons, cleaning out the bear's cage. Good luck. Try explaining that injury in church. And you thought scribes had it easy. Ever spent 12 hours copying Latin under candlelight in a freezing scriptorium with ink-stained fingers and scoliosis-inducing posture? The only relief is muttering rude marginalia into the margins quietly. Of course, the servants attending nobles during bath time, when baths happen, or helping them into complicated clothing, with all those layers and laces, face other dangers. Not physical, political. Whispered gossip, one misplaced glove, one poorly timed smirk, and you're suddenly implicated in a scandal that's entirely above your pay grade. Even stable hands are a stubbed toe away from disaster. Hooves crush, horses kick. One slip, and your head's next to a rusty horseshoe in the mud. And yes, even the Lord isn't safe. He may sit at the high table, but the risks that come with power are insidious. Poisoned wine, a hunting accident, a dagger in the night from a brother who thinks he'd look better in that velvet cloak. Historians still argue whether some medieval deaths were truly accidents or conveniently timed mishaps. In fact, there's a popular term among scholars now, castle fatigue. The cumulative stress of disease, cold, paranoia, and political pressure. You might call it burnout. In the 1300s, they called it Tuesday. Because truthfully, no one in this stone maze was ever truly safe. Castles were walls, yes, but they also trapped heat, waste, resentment, ambition. They weren't designed for comfort. They were designed for control. And now, sitting at the edge of the ramparts, looking over the misty countryside below, you start to understand. The castle wasn't just a death trap because of battles or bad food or falling from towers. It was a trap because it was a system. And systems eat people quietly, patiently, efficiently. You breathe the damp morning air. There's no battle today. The moat reflects the sunrise. A hawk cries somewhere above. Below, a farmer yells at a goat in a dialect you barely understand. And still you feel it. The stone beneath you. The weight of history. The whispered warning of every cracked staircase and smoking chimney. The castle doesn't hate you. It just doesn't care whether you survive, which makes your survival all the more incredible. Wind down 300 words, and now it's time to exhale. The fires are low. The banquet hall echoes only with faint footsteps and the soft rustle of rushes being swept. Somewhere far off, an owl hoots. You've made it through the siege, the feast, the foul-smelling guardrobe, and the 1,000 dangers tucked into every corridor. You've slept in straw and danced in silk. You've ducked falling masonry and watched banners unfurl. You've seen the best and worst of medieval life and come out breathing. Your clothes still smell of smoke and tallow. Your feet ache. But there's a strange peace settling in your chest. Because now you know. You know that castles weren't magical fairy tale places, nor pure nightmares. They were complicated, dangerous, and achingly real. Places of power and fragility, of beauty and rot, of feasts and famine. So as you lie back, wherever you are, imagine yourself safe for once, tucked into a quiet chamber. The stone walls are thick, but for tonight they protect instead of threaten. A candle flickers on the sill. The hum of the wind is just background music now. You're no longer the outsider. You've earned your place in this harsh, strange, astonishing world. Let your thoughts slow. Let your breathing soften. And know that for now, no trap has you in its teeth. The castle sleeps, and so should you. End of script. Sweet dreams.